Welcome, everyone. Ginny asked if there was anyone in the waiting room, and we're just watching the numbers increase by the minute.
Welcome, everyone. While we're waiting for people to enter the webinar, I'd like to take just a moment to run over some general housekeeping points. Today's program is being recorded and will be available to view on FCC's webpage in the upcoming week. During the program, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. You may post a question at any time using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, but we will wait until the end of the facilitated conversation to answer those questions. Thank you and enjoy the program. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. All right, good afternoon, and welcome to Frederick Community College for today's co-curricular call to action conversation on race with Dr. Beverly Tatum. I am Shamika Shepard, Associate Professor of Reading and a member of the co-curricular planning team. Our co-curricular theme, A Call to Action, aims to provide learning opportunities beyond a classroom for students, faculty, staff, and the community members. By bringing experts to our table with lived experiences and subject matter expertise, our end goal is to encourage and inspire our audience to move from thought to action on critical issues surrounding social justice, equity, inclusion, and human kindness. It is a pleasure to welcome my co-facilitator for today's program, Dr. Kathy Brooks, Department Chair of Communications, Humanities and Arts, and a member of the co-curricular planning team, who will be introducing today's speaker.
Thank you, Shamika, and good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for this really critical discussion. Personally, I can't tell you how excited I am to be privileged to have a conversation with really one of the country's foremost thought leaders on the subject of race. And I actually was introduced to your work by my college-age daughter, who was home for summer one summer, and it was the required reading at her college. And I saw the book on the nightstand, and I remember looking at the title and reading and saying, why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And I said to her, well, you know, that's a very interesting title. And she responded very animated and said, well, if you think that the title is interesting, wait until you read the book. And so I just thank you for allowing us a context where we can really discuss issues of race, not just in our interracial settings, but also in our intergenerational settings as well, which is so critically important. So it's my distinct honor to introduce you to Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Dr. Tatum is the President Emerita of Spelman College and is the author of the best-selling book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race, now in its 20th anniversary edition. A thought leader in higher education, she was the 2013 recipient of the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award and the 2014 recipient of the American Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology. Dr. Tatum holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan University and an MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, and an MA in religious studies from Harvard Seminary. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tatum.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and thank you to all who tuned in.
Okay. Well, let's just jump right in. Many of our faculty and staff and students really struggle with having conversations dealing with race. So, first of all, why is that the case? Why is it such a hard thing to have a conversation about? And what advice would you give to help us to begin engaging in these conversations in the different environments that we find ourselves in?
Sure. Well, let's start with why it's so hard. And I think for many people, it really goes back to childhood. I often like to ask audiences to give a few minutes, just to take a minute to think about your own earliest race-related experience. And if you think about that question, some memory is likely to have already popped into your mind. And if we were all in the same room together, I might ask for a showing of hands. How many of you have thought of some experience that you can recall related to race or racism? And most people would raise their hands. And then if I were to ask the question, well, how old were you? You've remembered something. How old are you in that memory? Many people would say 5, 6, 7. Some people may be older, maybe 10, maybe 15. Sometimes people say, well, not till I got to college. There's no right answer. It really has everything to do with where you grew up, what your experiences were. But for many people, again, if we were to ask for a show of hands, we might find that many people had their hand raised around 5 or 6 or 7, one of those early school years ages. And then if I were to ask the question, as I like to, what emotion, if any, is attached to that memory? And if I ask people to just call out some words, if we could hear each other in a large auditorium, we might hear words like confusion, fear, sadness, anger, frustration, embarrassment, shame, guilt. We might also hear words like friendship or love. It's not always an unhappy feeling that someone has, but for many people, the first experience they think of is attached to some of those early words like confusion, like fear, like sadness, like anger, like embarrassment. And then thinking about this, if we think, okay, many people had an experience, many people had it in their childhood, many people felt some discomfort. The next question I like to ask is, who did you discuss it with? Who did you talk to about this experience at the time that it occurred? An adult, a parent, a teacher? A lot of people will say, no one. I didn't talk to anyone about it, which is kind of unusual because if you have spent any time with 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds, one of the things you know about them is that they're pretty talkative. They're pretty chatty, especially in the company of a parent or even a teacher. They tend to blurt things out. They don't filter much. And so it's very interesting to think about why would so many adults have a memory of something they still can recall decades later that had an uncomfortable feeling attached to it, and yet they didn't talk to anybody about it. If we were all in the same room together, I might ask people to offer some explanations. But I can tell you the explanations that often come forward are things like, I don't know, I just didn't have the words. I didn't know what to say. I just was too confused. Or sometimes it has to do with, well, actually, it was my parent who did or said the thing that left me feeling concerned. So I don't know who I would have talked to. Or very commonly, people say, I just knew I wasn't supposed to. Something about the adult response. I knew this was not a topic they wanted to hear about, that I wasn't supposed to speak about it. And that idea that we're just not supposed to speak about it, I think is part of why, as adults, we have such a hard time. Because deep in our gut, so to speak, we've internalized this idea we're not supposed to speak about it, especially in the company of someone who's racially or ethnically different from ourselves. So that early socialization doesn't just happen once, it gets reinforced. We get that message over and over again. So by the time that we are in a college classroom, we've had a lot of experience not talking. We've learned that we're not supposed to talk. And it requires some courage, actually, some persistence to kind of push past that initial discomfort to really engage in the conversation. We might ask, well, why bother? Why is it so important? And I think fundamentally the answer to that question is this: you can't solve a problem you can't talk about. If we understand that this is a problem in our society, in our work environment, in our classrooms, if we understand that this is something we want to fix, how can we fix it if we can't talk about it? We have to feel able to break the silence, which is why I'm happy to be here today as part of this conversation, because it is so important. If we want to move forward in a positive direction, we have to be able to have conversation about this tough topic.
We're happy to have you here. Thank you so much. So in chapter 1 of your book, you discuss the importance of definitions. Why is it important that we have common language? And could you share and define with us some of the words like prejudice, racism, colorblindness, color silent, and color conscious?
Sure. So let's go back to why we need shared language. You know, if I say I'm talking about racism and I've got a definition that I'm using, and you say you're talking about racism, but you're defining it very differently, we might think we're having a conversation about the same thing, but we're not, right? Because we're using the words differently. So I spend in my book, the first chapter, chapter 1, talking a lot about these definitions. And the first one I want to talk about is prejudice, because sometimes people use prejudice, racial prejudice, and racism synonymously, as though they were the same thing. They certainly are related, but they are not the same thing, which I hope I can make clear. Racial prejudice is all about attitudes, right? We develop attitudes about people different from ourselves, sometimes attitudes about people like ourselves, on the basis of limited information, often based on stereotypes, often based on distorted information, information taken out of its context, not understanding why someone is saying or doing something, and then overgeneralizing that behavior or those statements or that attitude to a whole group of people. And those stereotypes are often found in our culture, popular culture, in the form of images we see on television, things we read in books, jokes we hear people tell, language we hear people use. That kind of information is so common. It's like breathing smog. You know, it's like in the air all around us. That's the analogy I use in my book. And if we live in a smoggy place, we are all going to be smog breathers, whether we want to be or not. It's just the only air available. So we're breathing this misinformation in, we're breathing it out, and it shouldn't surprise us if some of it sort of sticks to us, right? You know, just like the air we breathe, you know, it gets in our cells, the misinformation gets in our heads, and we use it to be able to understand the world around us. Even if we're wrong, we still think of it as like information that we can use to understand the world. That's where racial prejudice comes from. But prejudice is not the same thing as racism. Racism includes prejudice, but it's bigger than that. Racism is a whole system of advantage, which is based on the way people have been categorized racially. And when I say based on how people have been categorized racially, it's important to understand that the word race is most accurately applied when we talk about the human race, right? But the groups of people we describe as Black or white or Asian or Latinx might vary culturally, might vary in terms of their historical experience, but in terms of their human beingness, they are all human beings. We are all human beings. So we have to understand that racial categories are somewhat artificial and have been constructed by people. They're social categories that have meaning. You know, if you have been categorized as Black, your life experience is going to be different than if you have been categorized as white. And we might think, well, what do you mean categorized? You know, I can tell who's Black, I can tell who's white, I can tell who's Asian, etc. Those physical appearances help us determine those categories, but fundamentally they are artificial categories. Again, you know, genetically, this is something we've learned as a result of the Genome Project, right? Biologically, we know there are people who are categorized as Black who might look very different on the outside from someone who's categorized as white. But if you look at their DNA, very similar. The character, you know, the characteristics that determine whether your skin's dark or light or your hair's curly or straight are such a small fraction of your whole genetic makeup there, it's almost insignificant, except for the fact that we human beings treat people differently based on how we see them. And racism is a system that has been built to advantage those who appear white, appear light, appear European American or European of ancestry. White supremacy is about a hierarchy of human value, with white people being seen as superior or better than darker skinned people. And racism is built on that set of assumptions. Racism didn't start today or yesterday or the day before. It has been in place a long time. So I often use the analogy of like a conveyor belt, a moving walkway, because what's important about that moving walkway, if you think about like the moving walkway at the airport that takes you from terminal A to terminal B, if you step on that moving walkway, it carries you along. You don't have to be doing much. You can be standing still. But because the system is in place, it operates with or without your effort. But it's still operating. Even if you don't notice it, it's still operating. And so when we think about racism as a system of advantage, what we have to understand is that system is operating whether we are noticing it or not, whether we are paying attention to or not. And it impacts access to education and employment and healthcare and how long you live and where you live, and all dimensions of someone's life experience are likely to be shaped by where they fit in terms of this hierarchy of human value that is the system of racism. So I know I've said a lot, but that's just prejudice and racism, right? But if someone says, well, let me talk about anti-racism, because that's a term that we hear a lot right now, right? What's anti-racist? So let's imagine, back to my analogy of this moving walkway. If you are standing, if you step onto that moving walkway, let's imagine we're born and placed onto that moving walkway. The system was operating before we showed up, but it carries us along. Some people will recognize that that system is unfair, but maybe they like where it's headed. And they will say, you know what, I like where this is going. I believe in this system. I'm going to walk fast on this moving walkway. Like you see people at the airport, some people are standing still, other people are walking fast. The people who are walking fast are embracing the system and want to go where that moving walkway is taking them. But there are other people who don't, who will say, I don't believe it should be structured this way. I don't believe in that ideology. I don't want to participate in a racist system. I'm just going to stand still. But if you're standing still, the system is so powerful, it carries you along whether you are making an effort or not. It's operating whether you're paying attention to it or not. If you said to yourself, I don't like where this is headed, I think I'll turn around. Imagine that, turning around on the moving walkway. Now you're standing there, but you're traveling backwards, right? Because the moving walkway is still carrying you. You may not be looking where you're headed, but you're still traveling in that direction. The only way to interrupt the process is to be actively working against it. That is, walking fast in the opposite direction. If you want to get off that conveyor belt and don't want to go in the direction it's headed, you have to walk quickly in the opposite direction. And if we think about interrupting the cycle of racism, it requires action. You can't be passive and be anti-racist. You have to be actively working against that system in order to interrupt it. And you also asked me about color blindness. And so let's say a word about that. One of the ways that many people have grown up is with the idea that they should be, quote, colorblind. If I don't want to be racist, if I don't want to treat people as though they weren't of the same value as me, someone might say, then I need to not call names, and I don't want to, use racial slurs, or, I don't want to actively discriminate. But maybe I'm just going to pretend I don't notice, right? Maybe that's my goal, just to not notice physical difference. Well, we know that, of course, we do see those differences, unless you are physically unless your vision is impaired, you are noticing the physical differences. But when you say I'm colorblind, what you're saying is I'm trying to pretend I don't. But what does that mean to the person whose physical characteristics, whose racial identification you're trying to ignore? It might mean you're not noticing their life experience. I identify as an African-American woman, and if someone says, I don't notice you're Black, that might say to me, you don't notice something that's important to my daily life. That's not helpful. So trying to pretend we don't notice something that's important about someone else, something important to their identity, something important to how they view and experience the world, is not helpful. It is important, but I want to add, you asked me also about color silent. Sometimes when people say they're colorblind, or sometimes people will say, my children are colorblind. My kids don't notice whether someone is of a particular racial group. They never mention it. I often say it may not be that they have learned not to notice. It may be that they've learned not to speak about it. So when you don't speak about it, you're color silent. You're not colorblind. You're still noticing, you're just not talking about it. Color conscious might be to say, yes, I've noticed. I'm not discriminating. Nobody wants to be discriminated against. Notice doesn't mean you're discriminating. Notice might mean I'm noticing that this is an important part of your daily life, and I'm conscious that I need to be paying attention so that I don't engage in implicit bias. I want to bring my awareness forward so that I can interrupt the cycle of racism. I can have conversations about how we can create a more equitable society. So that's a mouthful, right? We've covered a lot. We've covered prejudice and racism and anti-racism and color blindness and color silence and color conscious. And you can see there's plenty to talk about, but it helps if we're all, at least, even if we don't agree. Someone might say, well, I don't agree with your definition of racism. I talk at great length in my book about why I think it's a useful definition. But even for people who start reading my book and they'll say, I'm not sure I agree with that definition. In some ways, it doesn't matter. At least you know what I am meaning when I say it. So you can, even if you don't agree, you can be clear about what I'm talking about. And I can be clear about what you're talking about if you share how you're defining your terms.
Can I ask a quick question? What are some of the other ways that people are defining racism?
Sometimes people say prejudice plus power, right? That's one definition of racism, prejudice plus power. The problem I have with that definition, not that it's a wrong definition, because social power, it's like if you have prejudicial attitudes and you also have social power to act on those attitudes, you can turn that prejudice into that systemic behavior, that's those systems that can be discriminatory. But all of us have some power, right? Even the person who feels like, and what do we mean by power? Power can be social influence. I like to say everyone has some sphere of influence. We all influence other people to some degree. Some of us have a big platform, some of us write books and give talks, and we have a bigger platform than people who don't do those things. But we all influence other people, whether those are people in our families, our friends, our classmates, our colleagues at work. We all have a sphere of influence. So I think that to say prejudice is about power, certainly power is a part of creating systems, but we all have some individual power. I think the biggest mistake, if I could call it that, the biggest difference is many people think of racism as individual acts of meanness. So if you say something's racist, you might be talking about, somebody wrote a racial slur on somebody else's locker. That was an act of meanness. Was it racist? We would all agree that it was an expression of racial malice. But that's different than if we only thought about racism as acts of meanness and everybody became nice to one another. If we were all behaving politely and nicely, we might still have racism in our society because it's built into the policies and practices. Schools are segregated not because people aren't nice on a daily basis. They're segregated because there's a history of exclusion that has led to residential segregation. Residential segregation leads to school segregation, access to healthcare and where doctors are located and how people access, even in this pandemic, who has access to vaccines and when and how readily. All of that has everything to do with the way racism has operated in our society in terms of access to resources. So if we just said, I'm going to be nice, you be nice, everybody's nice, those systems would still be in place. We might all be smiling, but those systems would still be in place. So we need to understand that racism is more than just individual attitudes or even individual behaviors. It is a system of policies, practices, and procedures that are really baked in to our society and will take considerable effort to undo.
Thank you. Wow, I feel like even though we're just getting started, that we already have had a full seminar. So I'm excited for you. First of all, and thank you for laying that framework as to why it's so difficult to have the conversation that we're having right now, and then for offering some common language around definitions and the importance of us, because that's something that we're working on in our strategic groups here at the college, looking at getting some common language around definitions of racism and prejudice. And so with that, also I wanted to remind our guest on the call that there is a Q&A. So if you do have questions, we'll be collecting those to be able to get those later on. And I just wanted to share with you that since you can't necessarily see the chat, that people are really appreciating the metaphors when you're talking about the slog and the moving walkway. Those are things that we can relate to and to help to make sense of this. If we look at the majority of our residents or the majority of our students at Frederick Community College are residents of the county. And the county has had a challenging history in terms of race relations. So could you discuss your concept of the ABCs as a tool to help us to foster a greater sense of inclusivity and belonging for our community here?
Sure. So when we talk about creating more inclusive environments, I do like to talk about what I call the ABCs because it's maybe it helps people remember strategies that we can all engage in to try to create an environment where everyone feels included. And the first, the A in the ABCs stands for affirming identity. I'm going to tell you all three and then I'll come back and define them more clearly. But the A, affirming identity, the B, building community, and the C is cultivating leadership. So what do I mean by A, affirming identity? Fundamentally, we all of us, doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, everyone wants to feel seen, heard, understood, right? You know, we don't want to be invisible. We want people to acknowledge us, to recognize us, to see us for our full selves. And A, affirming identity is really about making sure that we are all being seen. So what does that mean? Let's imagine we were all together in a room and there was a photographer there. And that photographer took a group photo of all of us. And at the end of our time together, each one of us got a picture, a copy of that photo. We would all do the same thing. If you've been handed a photo, a group photo, what's the first thing you're going to do? Look for yourself, right? You're going to look for yourself. That is the only right answer to that question. You are going to look for yourself in that photo. And let's imagine that for some reason, that photographer, before he gave out those photos, digitally removed maybe every 10th person. So 10% of us are going to look at that photo and we're not going to find ourselves in it because we've been digitally removed. We would look at that picture and we would say, what's wrong with this picture? I was there. I was standing right next to Professor Shepard on one side, and Kathy Brooks was on the other side of me. And yet I'm missing. What's gone wrong, right? But let's imagine that this happened a lot, maybe every day, just as a routine. There's a group photo shoot, and every day you get a copy of that picture. And every day you're the one who's been removed from it. After a while, you wouldn't say, what's wrong with this picture? After a while, you would say, what's wrong with me? Why is it, am I invisible? Why is it that I'm never in the picture? And that is the experience that some students have when they walk into a classroom. They don't see themselves in the curriculum. They may not see themselves in the classroom and as the professor, or even among the other students, depending on the situation. Being missing from the picture leads you to feel a sense of invisibility. And to the extent that you feel invisible, you feel disconnected from the learning experience. It's harder to engage when you are not feeling included. So the very first thing that I suggest to people around thinking about this A is to get in the habit of asking this question: who's missing from the picture? If I'm thinking about creating a program, who's missing from the planning committee? Who's missing from the list of people we might invite? Who's missing from, the community that I want to engage? If we get in the habit of asking who's missing from the picture, we are much more likely to be inclusive, because we're going to notice, gosh, there are no women in the room. Gosh, I need where are the people of color? Where are the voices of the young people? We're all middle-aged in here or older, where are the young voices? Asking that question, who's missing from the picture, will help us be more inclusive. B, building community is something that every educational institution and most organizations are engaged in, because when people feel a part of a community, they're more invested in its success. We're all rowing in the same direction, trying to achieve the same goal. whether that's our educational attainment or the academic excellence of the institution or whatever it might be. When we want to build a sense of shared community that everyone feels connected to, we do things like take group photos. We do things like plan community activities. We do things like try to engage our colleagues or our classmates in activities that will allow everyone to feel connected. And there's nothing wrong with doing the B, building community. In fact, it's important to try to do that. But when we do the B without thinking enough about the A, we find ourselves creating situations where people feel left out. So the B and the A really have to go together. Anytime you're trying to build community, you better be asking who's missing from this picture. Otherwise, you're likely to find an incomplete effort. You know, you tried something, but it didn't work as well as you thought. Somebody's feelings are hurt because they've been left out. The B didn't work as well as you wanted because you didn't pay enough attention to the A. The C, cultivating leadership, is really about how do we learn how to do the A and the B, right? Many of our students have come from communities where they didn't have an opportunity to practice. Many of our colleagues may have grown up in environments where they didn't really have an opportunity to practice. Connecting across lines of difference, building community when the community is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith community, a very diverse community. And how do we do that? A lot of people haven't had much practice because of the history of segregation, because of the history of separation. But colleges and universities are one of the few places where people have a lot of opportunity, if they take it, to practice. Because most colleges and universities have a diverse student body. Even institutions that you might assume don't. And I was the president of Spelman College for 13 years. It's a historically Black college for women. Many people might say, well, you know, what diversity do you have there? All the women are Black. Well, first of all, they're not all Black, but even if most of them are of African descent, even within the African American community, there are differences, right? There are folks who grew up in cities. There are folks who grew up in rural communities. There are folks who came from communities where maybe they were one of just a handful of Black students, and that experience is very different than growing up, let's say, in a majority Black community. Differences in terms of ethnic differences. You know, you could be a Black Latina, Puerto Rican. That's a different experience than being an African American from Virginia, whose family has been there for generations as a consequence of enslavement. So there are all kinds of differences that we can talk about, but learning how to navigate and connect across lines of difference is a leadership skill for the 21st century. And you have to practice to enable yourself to have that capacity. And those of us who are educators should be creating those opportunities for that practice. So affirming identity, building community, cultivating the next generation of leadership is critical if we want to really create an inclusive society going forward.
Thank you so much. Again, I appreciate the metaphors. I teach with metaphors, so I get it. It's very important to us understanding on in layman's terms what these things mean. So I really appreciate that. Let's go into the classroom. So a few people asked in the chat room about this, and this is one of our questions. Regarding, are we being color silent when we don't actively discuss issues of race in our classrooms because we don't feel like it's our place, or that it's irrelevant to the curriculum at hand, or maybe that we aren't comfortable?
Well, the short answer is, are we being color silent? The answer is yes. And so yes, we are being, when we don't, we are being color silent, but there are lots of reasons why people might choose to be color silent. So for example, maybe I am the math professor And, maybe I'm teaching math in the math department and I say, okay, I get it. Psychology, sure, you're going to talk about these topics in psychology, but how am I supposed to talk about it in math? Well, maybe it's about how you talk about, I'm not a mathematician, but let's imagine I'm teaching statistics. What word problems am I using? If I could break it down in that way, you can show a graph about anything. Let's show a graph about access to healthcare. And, let's show a graph about access to vaccines in this current moment, and let's do some analysis. And is it just random who's getting access and who isn't? Or is there, some data that we can analyze that helps us understand the way racism operates in healthcare, for example? That, there are ways to bring it in if you're ready to talk about it. But this is the other part. Are you ready to talk about it? Right? Mm-hmm. So if you want to, then sometimes faculty members certainly have shared with me their hesitation because they haven't had the practice. They can say, I don't want to start a conversation that might get out of hand or might create conflict in the classroom, or that I'm not really comfortable facilitating, or, maybe I will say something inadvertently that will be offensive. I don't want to be on blast on somebody's social media. How do I develop my capacity? And I would agree that it does take some practice to feel comfortable, but this is really one of the great ways that universities or institutions that have teaching and learning support centers. There are lots of institutions that provide professional development or support around improving one's teaching. If you have those kinds of resources available to you, learning how to facilitate a classroom discussion about race-related topics can be part of that learning, can be part of how we peer-to-peer support each other around improving our classroom practice. So there are institutions that have created study groups for faculty members to talk to each other about how do we do this. Maybe they're reading something together and talking about that book. Maybe they're sharing lesson plans. Maybe they are talking about how do I do this. Here's what I did in my classroom. Here's how it worked today. Maybe I could have done it differently. Maybe let me tell you what I did and you can give me some pointers. That kind of collegial sharing is very common on college campuses, and it is a great way to help people feel more comfortable in opening up these conversations. But I will say that students really appreciate it when faculty members do bring these opportunities into the classroom, because they're hungry for these conversations. They want to talk about what's happening in the world. And to the extent that they know they have faculty who are willing to engage in these conversations with them, I think can be a real gift.
Thank you. It's interesting just looking at the questions that are coming in. There's so much surrounding what you're saying. And actually one person recommended a potential title for your next book, that who's missing from the picture. So to acknowledge that. As you're talking about ways that, that ourselves and our colleagues can engage, I know that you taught a course when you were at Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara, on the psychology of racism. So what are your thoughts about having a dedicated general education course that's required of all students? Because that whole idea of identity is so fundamental to the way that we engage with all kinds of information.
Yes. Well, my UC Santa Barbara teaching experience was my very first one, where I was invited to teach a course on racism. And when I said, yes, I will do that course, I didn't quite know what I was getting into. What I mean by that was, I was very young at the time, 26 years old, and it was my first time teaching outside of, my graduate school experience. And, but when asked to do it, I thought, well, sure, I can do that. And it turned out to be a very powerful learning experience, not just for my students, but for me as well. But what struck me was at the end of the semester, students wrote things on their syllabus like, this course should be required for everyone. This has been one of the most powerful learning experiences I've had at the university. Why did I have to wait till I was a senior in college to have this conversation? There was a lot of enthusiasm about what they had learned and wanting to share it with their friends. And I went on, in terms of my own teaching career, to really make this course kind of a signature course. I didn't stay at UC Santa Barbara long. We were there 4 years, and then I moved back to Massachusetts and had a long teaching career at places like Mount Holyoke College before becoming a college president. But during those years that I was teaching, this would come up a lot. Students would often say, this course should be required for everyone. And while I would certainly agree that everyone should have access to this kind of learning, and I think it was really valuable for the students who did, the one hesitation I had about making it a requirement, a general education requirement, was, did the institution have enough people to teach it, right? If everyone's required, we're going to need a lot of sections. Do we have enough faculty to staff those sections? Do we have enough people who feel confident enough that they can, that they know the subject matter and that they can facilitate the discussions in ways that will be beneficial to the students? And I think this is a really important question. This summer, we have often, I've heard the summer described as the summer of racial reckoning following the George Floyd murder. And a lot of colleges and universities were thinking about how to respond to the racism on their campuses, and how to educate their students, and how to become an anti-racist environment. And I remember being contacted by a college president who told me his idea was to introduce a course like this one as part of the general education curriculum. And in my conversation with him, I said, this is not a bad idea. I certainly think many students would benefit, but do you have the faculty ready and able to teach it? And that, for a lot of people, is the stumbling block. So how do we get enough people ready to be able to facilitate these conversations in a way that will really be beneficial? Even as I say that, though, I always like to point out, when I started teaching about racism, I was 26 years old and I was not an experienced teacher, right? And I say that to say that you don't have to do it perfectly. When I started at the age of 26, I certainly knew a whole lot more when I was 46, right? 20 years later, I was much better at it, much more experienced, much more knowledgeable. And it was right around that time that I decided I would write my book, right? Not long, not quite 20 years in, but about 17 years in. I started in 1980. It was 1997 when I wrote the first version of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? That said, if I had waited until I could do it as well as I did, I never would have started if I was waiting to be perfect, right? If we wait for perfection, we would never start. We have to start knowing that we're going to make mistakes and be humble about that, and, ask for help when we need it. And when we say or do something in class that we think maybe we should have done differently, we can come back the next week and say, class, last week you asked me this question. Here's what I said. I've thought about it some more. I think this is probably a better response. So that there are ways that we can learn together. But Should it be part of gen ed? I think it would be fabulous if every student had the opportunity. The question is, do we have the infrastructure to support that?
That's a great point. Someone in the chat said not just enough people, but the right people.
Yeah.
So that's a great point. My last question to you is, how do we as educators both encourage and support students in their racial justice advocacy work? And how are we consciously or more often unconsciously dissuading them?
Well, this is a really important question. And I think it has every generation is going to do things in its own way, right? So I'm reflecting on my own experience as a college student. I went off to college, I learned a lot of things. I came home, I had opinions that I shared with my parents who had a different point of view, right? And it wasn't that we were so far apart in how our understanding, but they had come of age at a time when things were done a certain way. I came of age at a time when things were being done differently. Even today, when we look at like Black Lives Matter as compared to the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, one of the differences is the Black Lives Matter movement is much more diffuse. By that, it's not like built around the personality of one person. There's not like the Dr. King that everybody's rallied around, or the Malcolm X that everybody rallies around. It is, some people would say leaderless, but I would say not leaderless, but multi-leaders. There are leaders all over the place who in their own communities are rallying students to, not just students, but rallying people to speak up and take action and to write letters and to advocate in a particular way. And the use of social media, is generational in the sense that, when I was coming of age in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, I graduated from college in 1975. During that time, social media was not a tool we had available to us. We organized differently because of the technology or lack thereof that we were using. So this is to say that we as adults, but of course our students are adults too, but we as educators may think about strategies from our own lived experience. That said, we have to understand that students are living a different experience generationally. There may be differences, but fundamentally, we can support students in finding their voices. How do you help students find their voice? You help them write, you help them read, you help them think critically, you help them understand the difference between fake news and real news, right? And to the extent that we are empowering students to be effective communicators who can think critically about the issues that are important to them, then we are empowering them to be their own advocates. And I think that fundamentally as educators is the most important thing we can do.
Could not agree with you more.
Right.
And speaking of
Mhm.
students, just one of your students from fall who took your course in the fall of '95 reached out and just said it was one of the best courses that they've ever taken and how life-changing it was. So the impact carries on.
Wonderful
With
thing.
that, we kind of end, and I cannot believe that the hour is almost up because there are a ton of questions that we haven't gotten to, but I do want to take this one question from our Q&A that I think is important as we look at the work that we're doing. I don't think that, being mindful that today is the 1 year anniversary or the 1 year mark, if you will, of the murder of Breonna Taylor. The trial is about to begin with the situation with George Floyd.
Yeah.
Um, how do you take care of yourself personally and just advice for those of us that are in this work
Yes.
with
This is this is a really
a lifetime? I'm sorry. Please.
Yeah. My apologies for interrupting. It's a really important question. And I think that I like to share a piece of advice that was given to me a long time ago. And this, my friend said to me, the work that you do, talking to people about racism, leading workshops, writing, giving talks like this one, all of that takes a certain amount of energy, and you are putting out a lot of energy. Anytime you putting out a lot, you need to be taking something in, right? So my friend said it in this way: if you make a lot of withdrawals, you better make a lot of deposits. And I think, that's true if you're talking about your bank account. If you're withdrawing money, you better be putting some in. But the same in terms of spiritual energy, right? If you are expending the energy, you need to find a way to put it back in. And how you do that is going to depend a lot on your personality, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. For me, the most restorative thing is time alone. Whether I am spending time alone reading a book or taking a walk or meditating or listening to music, but just time by myself where I don't have to engage with other people, because I am at my core an introvert. That's how I replenish my energy. People who are extroverts might find that they replenish their energy by being around other people, by being out with friends and, spending time just chilling with people they feel good with, in whose company they can relax. But whatever it is that restores you, you need to do enough of that so that you're not running on empty. It is easy to burn out. But I think it is also important to say that it can be fun to engage in these conversations. It can be life-giving to feel connected to other people who are working toward a common goal. And so we don't want to just talk about this work as hard to do. It is hard to do, but it can also be energizing. And I have done a lot of professional development with teachers over the years. And one of the things that has always struck me are that some of those teachers have said to me at the end, this was really energizing. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we use up a lot of psychological energy not talking. If there's a big stinky elephant in the middle of the room, and I told you, do everything you can not to notice it. Don't talk about it. Don't mention it. Just pretend it's not there. You would have to expend a lot of psychological energy to tune it out. Mm-hmm. And that is what we all are doing when we say we didn't notice the racism. We have learned to tune it out, but we don't do it by accident. We tune it out because our brains have been trained to do that. And when we give ourselves permission to notice and talk about it and engage with others, all of a sudden that energy is available to us. So I think it's not a surprise when people say, gosh, that was energizing. It's energizing because we use a lot of energy pretending not to notice. Being able to talk about it frees us up.
And at the end of your book, you said that you were optimistic. That was 2017. Are you still optimistic today?
I am always optimistic. I am a professional optimist. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we always have a choice. At the end of Dr. King's last book, he wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And even though that book is now more than 50 years old, I highly recommend reading it because I think there are a lot of insights into our current moment. But at the very end of the book, he said, we all have a choice. We can choose chaos or we can choose community. And it's because we all have a choice that I am optimistic, because I think fundamentally, most people want community. Most people would prefer community to chaos. And if we understand that's the choice we're making, then we will all, at least most of us, the majority of us, will say, let's do what it takes to create a community where we can all feel included, feel welcomed, feel empowered. Fundamentally, that's in all of our interest. And I think at the end of the day, people will prefer community to chaos.
Thank you. I could not agree with you more, and I think that you have given us so many incredible pearls to not just pearls, but tools and resources and new ways of thinking, and for me personally, some inspired hope of moving forward in the work that we're doing. We are so grateful that you took some time from your busy schedule to be able to share your insight with us today. I also want to thank my co-facilitator, Professor Shepard, we're in the back as well, and we're looking at the questions, trying to feed in, because there's just so much. We could do this for, I don't know, another year or so, and probably not get to all the questions. So we're just so grateful, and there's a lot of comments in the chat as well, thanking you for your time. We would be remiss if we didn't also thank the co-curricular planning team for inviting you here and for the work that we're doing. There were lots of questions about where we could see this webinar again, and it will be on the FCC website, so please look for that. And so many people that want to share it or go back and reference things and hear things again, so that's very encouraging. And also just for I want to thank the Center for Student Engagement and Jeannie Winston-Muir, who has worked her and her whole team for bringing this together. And so thank you again so much, Dr. Tatum, for just coming and sharing with us, and for your authenticity and openness.
Thank you.
Well, really, it's been my honor, and a shout out to my former students. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.